Good afternoon, Mr. Skinner.
Good afternoon, Ivan.
We are happy to have you here at the City News. You just presented a speech at the conference. What was it about?
Well, it followed two themes. One was around what's happening with Fintech, which is a space that's grown very quickly into a very large market of 12,000 startups getting $110 billion of investment last year, double the year before. So it's a really hot space. But then my second part was about that we talk about Fintech, which implies we put the finance first. But in China, they talk about tech fin, and they put the tech first. And what's happening in China and in the African nations and in South America is that we're seeing financial inclusion, financial literacy, and financial wellness being a big focus, rather than just trying to do the same old boring banking faster and cheaper with technology, which is what Fintech tends to do.
That's interesting. So it's not just normative, it's not semantic, Fintech, tech fin. There's a thinking behind it.
There's a real difference. I mean, if you put the finance first, then it tends to be you take the same old products like mortgages and loans and do them the same way but in a cooler app. And so a great way to illustrate that is you take a annualized loan. I want $5,000 for 12 months and I'll pay it back. And you get that in a immediate friction-free app in real time. In TechFin, they say, you know what, you probably don't want an annualized loan. You might want a loan for the next 12 hours. It's not a payday loan, it's basically enabling you to do things differently. So you might want to insure yourself for the next 8 hours because you know you're going out the house with an iPad and a Canon camera. So you just want to insure for the 8 hours. You don't want an annual contract. And because it's technology first, you can do that. Whereas if you take the same old financial products, then you just make them the same in the app, but cooler.
Let's talk about your book, your new book, titled Digital Human. Am I right? I have not read it, but I've seen the foreword. And something that struck me about this book was what you talked about the stages in human evolution.
In Digital Human came out last year, and I really say we're going through the fourth revolution of humanity because when we became cognitive, we lived in very small communities, then we became civilized and lived in cities, and then we became commercial and lived in metropolises. And now, for the first time ever, everyone on Earth has access to a network to communicate and trade and talk and transact globally in real time. And some people criticize me for saying that because they say, if you're in the remotest part of Ethiopia or Sudan, you probably can't trade and transact on a mobile phone. And I claim that's quite ridiculous because I've seen it. Anybody who can get access to a mobile phone, and everybody on Earth can now trade and transact. And that's a real revolution in the way in which humanity behaves because we've never been connected one-to-one globally before, and now we are. And what that actually does, and that was another theme of my presentation, is that with digital inclusion, you can include everybody on planet Earth in the financial network, which we could never do before. 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 4.5 billion people were unbanked or underbanked. Now they can all be banked because it's just a digital file on a mobile phone.
Now let's look at it from this premise. We have perhaps 8 billion people on Earth today, compared with, we were significantly fewer 100 years ago, 500 years ago. And these people, enormous number of people on Earth today, they interact, and the technology is there for them to interact. Now, when we look at it from the point of view of data, it's enormous what is to be collated. And I'm talking about the systems and the methods for their storage and for their processing and implementing, using it to achieve what you want. I think it's a critical thing. The education we have today, is it sufficient for us to do some of the things I I feel you're talking about? I mean, for the average person.
I think so. I mean, education is going to have to change quite a lot because we're getting into an era in the next 20 to 50 years of artificial intelligence and robotics, and people talk a lot about machine learning. And if you think about what machines can learn, they can learn anything that's factual, statistical, numerical, but they can't learn emotions. And right now the way in which we educate is quite wrong, in that we educate based on the industrial era of ramming facts into children's heads and testing if they can remember them. And what we should actually be doing is teaching children things that machines cannot learn. Art, creativity, music, humanity. Emotional intelligence rather than rational intelligence. And the machines will manage an awful lot of what currently is done by humans. So what will humans do? Well, they'll move to a higher level, which is a higher level of creativity and thinking and being more human rather than less human. And that's going to be interesting. And a lot of people say, well, what about if the machines stop? If electricity runs out, what would we do? Well, that's an existential question. I don't think we're going to run out of electricity. We always find new ways of doing things. That's how humanity progresses. We always find new ways of doing things. But the one thing we're doing badly at the moment is education. We don't teach kids emotional intelligence. We teach them factual intelligence, which machines can learn.
And tell me something about this. I hear people talking about algorithms, talking about codes. I feel lost. Where does that put me in the emerging world, the education system? Am I well educated to survive in the emerging world you seem to imply?
Everyone's at a different level. And it's really down to how happy are you with your world. So a great example is Piyush Gupta, who's the chief executive of DBS, was talking to me about making digital change happen, and a lot of people are frightened of change, but that's because they haven't been shown how to change. And he used an illustration of his mum and dad, who are in their 80s, and he visited them for Christmas and gave them an iPad with Facebook and Instagram and everything on the iPad. And the following year came back for Christmas and noticed that the iPad was still in the box, not opened, and said, well, why didn't you use your present last year? And they said, well, we don't know how. So he spent Christmas showing them how, and now they're the biggest social media entrepreneurs you can imagine out of India, using it every day to communicate with the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. And I think this is really what's, again, slightly deficient, which is, we don't teach people enough. And I had a very interesting lesson some years ago, which is one of the banks I was working with decided they would put an education program in branch to tell people how to use digital services. And the old people loved it because they didn't know how, and to have someone show them was fantastic. Most of the people coming into the branch wanted to see what was going on. Do you know the people who didn't like it? People like you. Men in their 30s, were saying, I don't need to be shown this, I'm too good for this. And they were the ones who didn't want to be shown, even though they needed to be shown. Yeah. I'm not saying that's you. Are
we equipped? Are we naturally wired to relate with these things?
I think it's more that we are innately wired to communicate. And technology is a communications tool. So the fact that we can talk and interact with people globally through this technology is appealing to our DNA. I mean, I travel the world non-stop, and I've been doing this for 2 decades now, and particularly using social media for the last 10 years to amplify my reach. I blog every day, and I do that obviously because I know people read it and then invite me to come to Luxembourg or to other cities to talk. And I count amongst my friends many people that I've never actually met, except digitally, because the digital engagement of communication gets communities built digitally rather than physically. So it used to be that your community would be your village or your street, whereas now it's actually everybody in the world.
The financial institutions, let's talk about them. I've heard you talk about some of them not responding quickly and robustly enough to the opportunities fintech presents? Could it be out of fear that they don't really understand this thing? How do you respond to that?
But, good question, because I'm just working on a new project. And I got fed up with people saying banks are stupid, dumb, and not responding to digital transformation and change, because there are some that are actually doing really well. Not many, but some that are actually very big are doing really interesting things like JP Chase, BBVA, ING, DBS in Singapore, China Merchants Bank. So I've been working with these banks to learn what they're doing and to understand how they've done it, because I think the biggest issue most people have is they don't know how to make a transformational change. So they're stuck in an industrial business model of banking, and they have to make it a digital model of banking, which is completely different, and they don't know how to do it because the people at the leadership level are bankers and not technologists. And what's been interesting with these banks is that they've all been going through radical transformational change. So I'll take JP Chase, which is obviously one of the biggest banks in the world. They're spending $11 billion on technology. That's a huge amount. And right now about 30% is going into innovation. And a few years ago that was 20%. A few years from now it'll be half. So $5+ billion in innovation. But in this process, they've reduced their staff numbers by a third. So in 2016 they had 233,000 people, and they now have 160,000 people. And that's been because of automation. So we're seeing this radical transformation of these institutions. And what's been interesting about JP Morgan in particular is when they talk about their technology, they say there are people who will be disrupted, and then there will be the disruptors. We need to be a disruptor. So the banks are just sitting there saying, we can ignore this, it's okay, we'll let them get on with it, and we'll just wait and see. Well, they will be disrupted. I'd much rather be a disruptor.
What's the difference between an IT specialist and a developer in the fintech? I mean, I saw you specifically talk about a collaborative process between banks and developers.
Yeah, well, it's been interesting again looking at the way in which these banks that are doing digital transformation well are evolving. So historically you've always had a chief information officer and an IT function, but that's gradually dissolving. So you still have people who have to manage the infrastructure and maintain the systems, but from a developing and design view, they're moving into very small teams where the audit team sits with people who can code and design. The compliance people sit with people who can code and design. The regulatory, the marketing, the product, the service people all have designers and developers sitting alongside them in very small teams, designing and developing code to support the operations. And so what they end up saying is, technology is business, business is technology. You don't separate this. It's fully integrated in the organization and symbiotic. There's not many banks that are that evolved to that stage yet, but the ones that are doing digital transformation really well have got to that stage, or they're getting there, of integrating IT into the business.